Thank you, Catherine. Everybody's able to hear? Okay, I appreciate the attendance. I'm sure this is maybe nothing more than a tribute to the availability and announcement of free food. And it's really a pleasure and an honor, really, to participate in the program, Catherine, that you have enunciated and orchestrated. Founded in 1948, Brandeis provided a refuge to the intellectual migration that Nazism generated and became something of a custodian of Weimar culture. The early phase of this university's history thus exemplifies the deprovincialization that the liberal arts are expected to promote and echoes the transatlantic transmission of learning that typified colonial New England itself. What helped make Brandeis distinctive was the dedication of refugee scholars to the ideal of Bildung, a well-conducted life that was supposed to honor the sublime legacy of Western civilization itself. Bildung meant the cultivation of character through the refinement of taste, the intensification of education through the exploration of the heritage of thought and art. That legacy was generally believed to be fully realized among speakers of German and constituted an intellectual and aesthetic achievement that had to be enriched and perpetuated. To try to live according to the demands of Bildung required of its devotees to have a formidable learning at their fingertips, and those fingertips had to be as sensitive as a safecrackers. The rise of Nazism meant that the vitality of Bildung, to which much of post-emancipation Jewry was dedicated, could not be sustained. The point need not be labored. The German Jewry did not die a natural death. But elements of the cosmopolitan grandeur of Weimar culture would manage to endure among several of the teachers who secured employment at Brandeis, an institution named for a jurist whose last experience of formal learning prior to Harvard Law School had been a couple of years of study in a high school in Dresden. A radiant and cosmopolitan German culture was fragmented, dissipated, and imperiled. But in Waltham, the expiration date that Nazism expected to stick would be extended into the decades immediately after the Second World War. Helping to promote the gravitational pull of the Weimar Republic was Albert Einstein. As a rationalist whose sympathies were with socialism, with internationalism, with Zionism, and with pacifism, he personified the humane leftist politics of the Weimar Republic and came to symbolize everything that its enemies detested. When he arrived at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton in 1933, the most illustrious refugee from the Third Reich quickly realized how institutions like Princeton University promulgated a quota system in admissions to suppress the proportion of Jewish undergraduates. By March 1935, Einstein was writing to Justice Brandeis about the need to respond to bigotry by founding a Jewish-sponsored institution of higher learning. And he expected such institutions to, in fact, achieve the standards of Bildung. Einstein's public endorsement consolidated the effort to give birth to Brandeis University in 1948. He was, after all, the most famous scientist in the world, indeed the most famous scientist who ever lived. He promised, and I quote, "I would do everything in my power to help in the creation and guidance of such an institution as Brandeis. It would always be near to my heart," end of quote. That pledge was rather quickly broken upon perceiving that the university was already becoming, in Einstein's views, too conformist, too accommodating to the national consensus. For Einstein, the university did not seem Jewish enough because of what he took to be its feeble resistance to political orthodoxy. But under Abram L. Sacker, the founding president of Brandeis in the first 2 decades, the bohemian atmosphere was peculiar enough. The formalities of academic life were often ignored. Martin Peretz, who entered as a freshman in 1955 and later became editor-in-chief of the New Republic, recalled that it wasn't yet a research university. Faculty members were appointed because they were interesting. Inevitably, a certain freewheeling, chaotic excitement was sacrificed for an absolutely required intellectual and bureaucratic stability, end of quote. The initial group of trustees betrayed little familiarity with the intricacies of academic life. One trustee, for instance, apparently did not realize that teaching loads are reckoned in terms of hours per week. Having asked a young faculty member how much he taught, and getting the answer 12 hours, The trustee thought for a moment and commented, "That's a pretty good working day. President Sacker expects a lot from his faculty." In building the university, the new president depended upon the philanthropy of such businessmen, especially nouveau riche who had come, or whose parents had come, from Eastern Europe. One of them, Jacob Goldfarb, funded the library. Upon learning that Sacker was intending to sell off each room to other donors, Goldfarb gallantly offered to remove his own name from the library so the president could sell it all over again. Sacker gave these mostly self-made entrepreneurs a chance to feel that they could give something back to a nation that had enabled them to prosper. In the old world, such merchants might have been disdained as parvenu. But in Waltham, they were elevated through Sacker's charm, eloquence, and persistence into patrons of learning. His skill in soliciting financial support was so legendary that he was nicknamed the Solicitor General of the American Jewish community. A son-in-law of Einstein's, Rudolf Kaiser, came to teach at Brandeis beginning in 1951 as one of then 71 faculty members. Kaiser had served from 1922 until the collapse of the Weimar Republic as the editor-in-chief of a leading literary magazine, Die Neue Rundschau. In 1930, under the name of Anton Reiser, he published an early biography of his father-in-law. 3 years later, Kaiser managed to save the papers that Einstein had kept in Berlin. The physicist's stepdaughter, Ilse Einstein, was Kaiser's wife. And because she was the older daughter of Elsa Löwenthal, who was the second wife of the physicist and his first cousin as well, Ilse was also Albert Einstein's first cousin, once removed. That family demonstrates that physics has no monopoly on complexity. A year after fleeing the Third Reich, however, Ilse died in Paris. Kaiser fled to Paris, where he taught at the Sorbonne before finding asylum in New York, where he joined the New School for Social Research and Hunter College. Having published biographies of Spinoza and Kant, Kaiser taught philosophy at Brandeis, though in 1953 he switched to Germanic language and literature. But not even his notable presence on campus could persuade Einstein to accept an honorary degree from Brandeis or to have anything further to do with the institution that he had once championed. Kaiser incarnated Bildung and can be considered a representative refugee intellectual. He retired from Brandeis in 1964. The Jewish-sponsored university that his father-in-law had envisioned would have been anomalous without curricular distinction in Judaic learning, especially when few other secular colleges or universities were offering any programs or professorships in Jewish studies. The first Judaic scholar to arrive in Waltham was Nachum M. Glatzer. Born in 1903 in Lemberg, Galicia, which was then part of Austria in the Habsburg Empire, Glatzer moved with his family under the pressure of the Great War to Bohemia in 1915. 5 years later, he got to Frankfurt, where he found himself at the very center of a remarkable recuperation of Jewish learning, the most sophisticated center not just in Germany, but probably in the entire world. Glatzer met Franz Rosenzweig in a Talmud class and immediately came under his influence, and later helped him compile an index of rabbinic sources for his major contribution to religious thought entitled in English, The Star of Redemption. Glatzer also joined the future psychoanalyst Erich Fromm to study how the Zohar, the Book of Splendor that comprises the most important Kabbalistic text, could illuminate the Book of Ruth. Joining the faculty of the Freies Jüdisches Lehrhaus in Frankfurt, Glatzer taught the Bible and Midrash, a method of interpretation of Judaic texts, and also helped Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig in their heroic enterprise of translating the Hebrew Bible into German. Glatzer entered the University of Frankfurt in 1928 and completed his doctoral dissertation under the direction of Buber and the Protestant theologian Paul Tillich in 1931. In the summer of 1932, Glatzer succeeded Buber in teaching Jewish religion and ethics at the University of Frankfurt. Buber resigned his post the following year when Glatzer left for Palestine, where he stayed for 4 years and edited a number of source books. In 1950, when Glatzer came to Brandeis, it was the first secure professorship he had ever held. He was already 47 years old. The university formally divided the curriculum and the faculty into departments in 1953. 4 years later, he chaired Near Eastern and Judaic Studies and served in that capacity until 1969. Glatzer was, by all accounts, a beloved teacher, and his course on Jewish thought was typically among the university's most popular offerings. He kept a collection of notebooks of his thousands of students, and some of his comments about them were written in Greek, possibly because he wanted to conceal unfavorable verdicts upon their undergraduate performances, those who had failed to live up to the standards of Bildung. One of Glotzer's students, a member of the class of 1959, was Abbie Hoffman, future co-founder of the Youth International Party, or Yippies. Hoffman once remarked that the only persons who ever called him by his given name, his birth certificate, Abbott, were his own father and FBI agents. To that list, add Nachum Glotzer, whose formality of manner bestowed a certain old-world dignity upon a brash, pioneering campus. He retired from Brandeis in 1973, and by the time of his death in 1990, Glotzer had authored, edited, or translated over 50 books. Glotzer's influence can be only briefly suggested. W.H. Auden once bravely claimed that what Dante was to the Middle Ages, Kafka is to the modern age. In 1934, a decade after Kafka died in virtual obscurity, Schocken Books acquired the literary rights to his largely unpublished and sometimes unfinished work. How he came to be appreciated as so representative a writer owes something to Nachum Glotzer, who joined the international team of editors preparing a critical edition of Kafka's works. On his own, Glotzer also edited anthologies of the writer who registered more indelibly than any other the bleak tonalities of Central Europe. It has been calculated that for the past decade and a half, somewhere in the world, every 10 days, a book on Kafka is published. Anyone having trouble keeping up with these secondary works should therefore pin part of the blame on Nachum Glotzer. In the evolution of Jewish thought, however, his most important achievement lay elsewhere. Having brought the Rosenzweig archive with him to Boston, Glotzer introduced the thought of Franz Rosenzweig to readers of English. His account of an authentic language registered very sharply. In 1966, when Commentary magazine asked 36 American rabbis about their religious beliefs and how their Judaism had been shaped, one discovery must have come as a special surprise. The greatest single influence on the religious thought of North American Jewry, the editor of Commentary of that symposium concluded, was Franz Rosenzweig, a German Jew who was not even a rabbi. In the religious history of American Jewry, at least in the past century, there may be no greater instance of that process of deprovincialization. While Glotzer had been advancing the Jewish Renaissance in Frankfurt am Main, Simon Rabidovich had become a key figure among the small group of Hebraicists in Berlin. And there, in 1919, he founded a publishing house for Hebrew writers, most of whom were in fact living in Weimar, Germany. As a student of Hebrew, Rabidovich was inevitably a Zionist. But so long as mass immigration to Palestine was historically implausible, he believed that cultural creativity elsewhere ought to be encouraged. Earning income as a librarian at the Berlin Jewish community, Rabidovich also worked on the Jubilee edition of the collected writings of Moses Mendelssohn. That edition appeared in 1929, 2 centuries after the philosopher's birth. Rabidovich's Zionism did not prevent him from becoming a Prussian citizen in 1930. He hardly felt either gratitude or enthusiasm in picking the fatherland over the promised land, however. And he recalled, when the German officer who handed me the diploma yesterday said, "Jetzt sind Sie Preuße, now you are Prussian," he recalled the process, he said, gave me the shivers. That September, the Nazis increased their representation in the Reichstag from 12 to 107, and became the second largest party in the legislature. The Weimar Republic was clearly living on borrowed time. 3 years later, the point of Rabidovich's newly acquired citizenship had evaporated. Dislocation was his fate. He'd been born in 1896 in Lithuania, when it still belonged to Tsarist Russia. Only after the Great War did the borders change, making his hometown Polish. Rabidovich's own family had moved to Bialystok during the war, and when the city became Polish in 1919, he came to Berlin. At the University of Berlin, Rabidovich studied philosophy, history, and Semitics, and a friendship was formed with the Hebrew poet Chaim Nachman Bialik. But Rabidovich was reluctant to move to Palestine, where no university yet existed, and remained and got to London not long thereafter. But in 1941, the family moved further within England, and in 1951, 54-year-old Rapaporte arrived on the Brandeis campus. And as a professor of Hebrew literature and Jewish philosophy, he joined the half-dozen full professors at Brandeis. Too tiny to split into formal departments yet, the new institution offered a curriculum that included a field of concentration in Hebrew literature. And by 1953, Brandeis dared to emulate Princeton University. Graduate programs would be formed unaccompanied by any professional schools, such as medicine or law or business. Rapaporte welcomed the opportunity at Brandeis to teach in Hebrew, and he generally wrote in Hebrew rather than in English. When Nedges was inaugurated at the undergraduate level, he became chairman, a position that he held until his death in 1957. A rabbi forced into exile arrived on campus in 1954 on a provisional basis. Among those who came under the Jacob Ziskin visiting professorships was Alexander Altman. He would become the third key figure in Judaic studies during the first phase of the life of Brandeis University. The son of a rabbi, Altman was born in Habsburg, Hungary, and went to study at Friedrich Wilhelm's Universität, now University of Humboldt. And from 1933 onward, the American academic community was more receptive than any other nation to the absorption of Weimar in exile. Altman found professional opportunities when he tried to escape from Germany, thinner in Great Britain than the United States might offer, and he was able to take an opportunity to come to Brandeis. As a teacher and a scholar, the rabbi exhibited a breathtaking range of interests that matched the scope of Glotzer's and of Rapaporte's. During commencement weekend this past May, one of the honorary degree recipients, Leon Wieseltier of the New Republic, claimed that Altman was the most learned Jew he had ever known. Altman was also pivotal in making microfilms available to advanced students. Armed with a special grant in the summer of 1962, Altman inspected several Italian libraries and archives and duplicated about 1,000 items, including biblical commentaries, philosophical texts, and Kabbalistic writings. Another opportunity to add to the holdings of the university came from Pope John XXIII, who gave permission for the microfilm of Vatican codices to be translated to Pope Pius XII Library at St. Louis University. In 1961, its president, Father Paul Reinert of the Society of Jesus, told Sacker, who had grown up in St. Louis, that if Brandeis could come up with the funds, permission would be granted to provide a second microfilm of those precious 800 volumes. Brandeis would therefore enjoy the distinction of sharing the greatest such scholarly resource in the Western Hemisphere, and Altman was the perfect choice to be in charge of this treasure. What happened next, though recorded in Sacker's memoir, has been embellished in oral tradition. Sources agree that Sacker phoned the Archbishop of Boston, Richard Cardinal Cushing, and explained the scholarly significance of this request. Cushing asked President Sacker how much money would be needed to buy that second microfilm from the Jesuit institution in Missouri. Sacker told him about $13,000 and was astonished at the crispness of the Archbishop's reply. "You'll have the money in the morning." An amazed Sacker, who cultivated donors patiently and deliberately, must have wondered how Boston's archdiocese could regard so huge a sum as chump change. So he asked Cardinal Cushing how the funds could be raised so quickly. "That's easy," Cushing is supposed to have replied. "I'll just call up all my rich Jewish friends." Altman contributed to several fields of learning, but perhaps the culminating achievement of his scholarly career came in 1973 with the publication of a biography of Moses Mendelssohn, the first of Germany's stepchildren to experience the ambiguities of emancipation in civil society and to try to reconcile the identities of Jew and German. No biography has surpassed or superseded Altman's tome. One historian of German Jewish thought, Alan Arkush, has even gone so far as to assert that Altman was unquestionably the leading Mendelssohn scholar, not only of recent times, but of the past 200 years, end of quote. Few others knew as intimately as did Altman the two facets of the German Jewish synthesis, that his subject personified: the struggle to harmonize the rational ideals of the Enlightenment with the ancestral loyalties of a believing Jew. The experience of exile and multidisciplinary versatility were integral to the career of Aaron Gurevich, born in 1901, died in 1973. Born in Vilna, attending a German high school in Danzig, studying mathematics and philosophy at the universities of Berlin and Freiburg, and then pursuing psychology at Frankfurt am Main. After getting his doctorate in philosophy at Göttingen, he became a phenomenologist, which meant, Gurevich wrote, that the preeminent task of philosophy may be defined as accounting for objects of every type and kind, and for objectivity in every conceivable sense in subjective terms, that is, in terms of acts of consciousness, end of quote. In 1933, Gurevich escaped to France, where he taught at the Sorbonne, under the tutelage of a number of key figures, and came to know young, promising philosophers like Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Jean-Paul Sartre. Gurevich had thus managed to adapt to both sides of the Rhine, and presumably would have remained in France had it not been invaded in 1940. His first teaching jobs in the United States were temporary. Gurevich went from Johns Hopkins to Harvard, where he taught physics, then to Wheaton College in Norton, Massachusetts until 1948, and landed a job at Brandeis that year. Like Rudolf Kaiser, Gurevich was too versatile to be confined to a single discipline at Brandeis. He served as assistant professor of mathematics until 1951, then became an associate professor of philosophy for the next 4 years. Promoted to full professor, he headed the new Department of Philosophy until 1959, when he left the new School of Social Research. He told a Brandeis colleague that he never really felt at home in America, where phenomenology did not catch on in philosophical circles until the 1960s. In 1957, while teaching at Brandeis, Gurevich published his first book. The American market was limited, however, for it because the text was in French. He continued to write mostly in French and German for readers overseas, and except for a passing interest in William James, showed no curiosity about American philosophy. Not only could accents be dropped and countries abandoned, names could easily be altered as well. Take Ludwig Cohen, born in Berlin in 1913. Precociously active in anti-fascist and leftist politics, he left Germany exactly 2 decades later and was educated in France. There he studied sociology and comparative literature at the Sorbonne, thanks to free tuition. And his first scholarly article was published in French on Heine in France. With the military collapse of the Third Republic in 1940, he was put into a French internment camp, but was released in time to get one of the last entry visas into the United States before it too became a belligerent. During the Second World War, he adopted the name Louis Clair, writing for the radical American journal Politics, as well as such journals of the French resistance as the Combat of Albert Camus. The camouflage of Louis Clair must have been insufficient, however, because under the name of Euripakos, he also contributed a weekly column in the early 1940s to a Trotskyist magazine called Labor Action. By 1947, his English was good enough for publication in Partisan Review. But a parallel academic career was also resumed, and he began teaching at the University of California, reinvented under the name of Louis Koser. In 1948, the University of Chicago offered him a job to teach sociology, though he had not yet begun graduate work in that subject at Columbia. In 1951, Brandeis hired him, 3 years before earning a doctorate, to become the first sociologist to join the faculty as a lecturer in social sciences. He had acquired American citizenship only 2 years earlier. The doctorate that Koser earned in 1954 facilitated promotion to an assistant professor of sociology, with a salary increase from $4,800 to $5,100. He invited his former colleague on the Trotskyist magazine, Labor Action, Irving Howe, to apply for a position to teach English at Brandeis. Howe then belonged to a socialist circle of ex-Trotskyists under the leadership of Max Shachtman. The group managed to get added to the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations. But in 1953, Howe was nevertheless hired at Brandeis. As democratic socialists, Koser and his new colleague refused to accept Stalinism as an historical necessity. And in 1954, they co-founded Dissent, based on a conversation on campus. Koser suggested the name of the magazine to be Dissent. It became, and has probably remained, the most important American political journal, edited from an explicitly democratic socialist stance. Unlike almost every other comparable English-language periodical, this independent leftist journal never ceased appearing. In other words, another way of thinking about it is Dissent has even outlived such venerable weeklies as the U.S. News and World Report and Newsweek. In 1957, Koser and Howe would co-author a book on the American Communist Party, Critical History, which has endured as a standard work of the subject. Their research assistant was Michael Walzer of the class of 1956, who would succeed Irving Howe as the editor of Dissent. Koser himself is perhaps best known for his revised doctoral dissertation, The Functions of Social Conflict, published in 1956. In challenging the functionalism that then dominated American sociology, Koser wanted to shift the balance of analysis away from the evidence of equilibrium toward the instability the velocity of history tended to produce. Where, in functionalist theory, Koser demanded to know, and I quote, were the horrors and inhumanity of the world that we have just lived through, end of quote. And therefore, he felt that the study of social harmony was simply inadequate. In any case, the author seems to have generated endless friction with President Sacker, at least according to Sacker's memoir, which recalled that the sociologist regarded university governance as an adversary proceeding. He was not pleased with a portrait of him in Sacker's memoir, A Host at Last, and explained in a letter to Sacker that, quote, even though we might not have seen eye to eye, I want to say that I found my Brandeis years the best of my life, and I know that it was you who made this possible. And then he added, one criticizes those one loves, end of quote, which happens to be the thesis of Michael Walzer's wonderful book, The Company of Critics. By the time of their reconciliation, Koser had gone from Brandeis more than 2 decades earlier and would become the president of the American Sociological Association. But the most famous German-born Jew ever to teach at Brandeis was Herbert Marcuse. In 1954, he came to the campus as a professor of politics and held a joint appointment in the History of Ideas program as well. In a decade when the nation's most popular work of nonfiction was the Reverend Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking, that is the most popular work of nonfiction, other than the Bible, which bestseller lists classified as nonfiction. Marcuse cut an incongruous figure. He insisted on the value of negative thinking, of ideological opposition to industrial and consumer capitalism. He exalted what he would come to call the Great Refusal. His 2 best-known and most important books, Eros and Civilization and One-Dimensional Man, were both published while he taught at Brandeis. But both Michael Walzer of the class of 56 and Martin Peretz of the class of 59 always claimed that at Brandeis, the 1960s came in the 1950s. And Marcuse personified that rather advanced case of radicalism. No one during the 1950s could have foreseen the stunning emergence of a decade later of an international New Left, or that he would often be designated as its unofficial faculty advisor. In 1968, at the crest of the radical movement, protesting students at the University of Rome were brandishing slogans with the alliterative names of Marx, Mao, and Marcuse. As one of the marquee names associated, more or less broadly, with dialectical materialism, Marcuse is, at least so far, the only Brandeis faculty member ever to have been explicitly condemned by the Vatican. In 1969, Pope Paul VI singled out Freud and Marcuse, denouncing them, and now I'm quoting, for sponsoring the disgusting and unbridled manifestations of eroticism, the animal, barbarous, and subhuman degradations that were cloaked as liberty, packaged as emancipation from conventional scruples, end of quote. Another sign of iconic status came in the spring of 2008, when the leader of the French New Left in 1968, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, spoke on the Brandeis campus to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the near collapse of France's Fifth Republic that he had seemed almost capable of pulling off by himself. No one had a stronger claim to have personified the international scale of the New Left in the 1960s than Daniel Cohn-Bendit, whose parents, it so happened, had known Hannah Arendt. And I'm very grateful to Sabina von Mary for seating me next to Daniel Cohn-Bendit at the lunch. And he summarized the problem of the 1960s by mentioning two thinkers who had studied with Martin Heidegger, when Cohn-Bendit asserted, quote, that instead of reading Marcuse, we should have been reading Hannah Arendt. Born in Berlin in 1898, Marcuse studied at the University of Berlin and earned a doctorate in 1922 for a dissertation on novels that were written about artists. Then Heidegger inspired him to study further. Marcuse worked on the ontology of Hegel. Marcuse studied with Heidegger from 1928 until the very end of 1932, and just before the Nazis seized power, Marcuse immediately found refuge with the Institute for Social Research, which had relocated in Geneva. Marcuse reached New York in 1934, and from then until 1940, he lived in New York and belonged to the Institute for Social Research, which had installed itself at Columbia University as well. The Second World War brought Marcuse to Washington, where he joined the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime forerunner of the CIA. After the war, Marcuse moved over to the Department of State and became director of the East European section of the Office of Intelligence Research. As the Cold War was intensifying, as pressures were mounting against officials suspected of diverging from an unsettled brand of anti-communism, a paradox could thus be formulated. The leading expert in the Department of State on the politics of the most critical site in Europe of the Cold War, namely Germany, happened to be a radical critic of the Cold War itself. And eerily enough, Marcuse was left alone. But he appears to have jumped at the chance to come to Brandeis, which dangled before him the first full professorship he had ever held. He was then 54 years old. And it says something about the unconventional hiring practices at Brandeis, that the list of English language publications on his CV consisted of one book, Reason and Revolution, which was a revised dissertation on Hegel that had been published 13 years earlier, plus one book review. And he too would become a contributor to Dissent. Having been provided with his first full-time permanent teaching position, Marcuse expressed his appreciation by dedicating his most controversial essay, Repressive Tolerance, quote, to my students at Brandeis University. He had blamed the Weimar Republic for failing to crush the emerging Nazi party. The civil liberties granted to the Nazis, he believed, enabled them to achieve power that they used to destroy the civil liberties of everyone else. Hence, Marcuse proposed that the protection of the First Amendment be denied to American advocates of, quote, aggressive policies, armament, and chauvinism, end of quote. He also wanted the constitutional freedom of expression to be withdrawn from citizens who opposed, quote, the extension of public services, Social Security, Medicare, etc. That open-endedness of that, etc. might well be noted. Thus did a doomed democracy in the 1920s continue to haunt the attitude he harbored 3 decades later in Waltham. Marcuse taught at Brandeis for 12 years until he reached the mandatory retirement age in 1965, when he decamped for the University of California in San Diego. Death came in 1979. His pedagogical effectiveness deserves to be briefly reported. The testimony comes from a member of the class of 1965, who Marcuse praised in 1970 as, quote, the best student I've ever had in more than 30 years that I've been teaching, end of quote. At Brandeis, Angela Davis majored in French literature, writing her senior thesis on the influence of phenomenology on the Nouveau Roman, the new novels of Alain Robbe-Grillet. But she was increasingly drawn to philosophy, first sitting in on Marcuse's lectures. She recalled his presence dominated everything. There was something imposing about him which evoked total silence and attention when he appeared. The students had a rare respect for him, and she recalled that concentration upon his words was total. And she recalled, if at the sound of the bell Marcuse had not finished, the rattling of papers would not begin until he had formally closed the lecture, end of quote. Before Angela Davis graduated, Phi Beta Kappa, she enrolled in a tutorial with Marcuse on the philosophy of Kant. Having already attended some of Theodore W. Adorno's lectures in the summer of 1965, 1964 at the University of Frankfurt, she accepted Marcuse's recommendation to return to Frankfurt to study with his friend. With formidable contributions to sociology, musicology, philosophy, and literary studies, Adorno was the personification of Bildung. So much so that Marcuse admitted that not even he could fully understand Adorno's work. The friendship between Marcuse, who remained in exile, and Adorno, who had relocated from the United States to the Federal Republic, was noteworthy because the most radical member of the Brandeis faculty was probably unique in cultivating a significant liaison with post-war Germany. In 1967, when he came to West Berlin to deliver 2 lectures at the Free University, the largest lecture hall on campus had to be assigned. And in that year, his most influential book, One-Dimensional Man, appeared in German translation. In barely a decade, as the 1950s bled into the 1960s, he had risen from nearly total obscurity to international fame. And when Davis herself returned to the United States, it was to a nation in turmoil. Abandoning her advanced studies in Kant, she became a communist. And in 1980 and again in 1984, she would run for the nation's second highest office on the Communist Party ticket. It will be no surprise to learn that the party fell a little bit short in the Electoral College, though not for that reason the Communist Party later expelled Marcuse's most famous student for the heresy of what was called reformism. Thus was capped a story that could be traced, however sinuously, back to the neo-Marxist revisionism of the Frankfurt School, first enunciated in the Weimar Republic. Its impact on the Brandeis campus was highlighted by one episode that evoked the artistic glory of pre-Nazi Germany. Perhaps its most popular and most enduring cultural artifact was the Treaure, which opened in Berlin in 1928, with music by Kurt Weill, lyrics and libretto by Bertolt Brecht. 5 years later, the Threepenny Opera arrived in New York, where it tanked after only 12 performances. For nearly 2 decades thereafter, no one in the United States had attempted a revival of the Threepenny Opera, until it got included in the first Festival of the Arts at Brandeis in the late spring of 1952. Weill, who was the son of a cantor from Dessau, had died 2 years earlier, and his widow, Lotte Lenya, who had made her Weimar reputation in the role of Pirate Jenny, sang the role on campus. The translation and adaptation were by Mark Blitzstein, who between the songs provided the narration for what had to be, for financial reasons, only a concert version instead of a fully realized performance. Ambition had simply outstripped the budget for the arts. In the orchestra pit, conducting Weill's score, was a professor of music, the 34-year-old Leonard Bernstein. He'd agreed to introduce and to direct a campus arts festival, and he became the chief vehicle for the Americanization of the Treaure. To do so while McCarthyism was raging entailed an element of bravado. The nation's political atmosphere, Bernstein wrote to a Brandeis colleague, encouraged caution and fear. Bertolt Brecht was then living in East Berlin, his Stalinism intact. In translating his left-wing musical from the spirit of Weimar to a suburban Boston campus, the Festival of the Creative Arts was asking audiences to confront a savage satire that portrayed capitalism as indistinguishable from criminality, that equated free enterprise with predatory cruelty. So heartless are the economic arrangements depicted in the Threepenny Opera that Mac the Knife demands to know what is the robbing of a bank compared to the founding of a bank. In the Threepenny Opera, a premium is put on treachery, on the betrayal of friendship and love, and the Brecht-Weill underworld consists of sheer misery. The progressive politics to which Bernstein subscribed heightened the audacity of the undertaking at Brandeis. At mid-century, Leonard Bernstein was not yet the triumphant incarnation of American music that he would become, and his status was hardly secure. In 1950, CBS had blacklisted him. Life magazine had run a photo of him as a dupe of the communists. The FBI had put him on its security index. The Department of State had even imposed passport restrictions, a formidable barrier to a conductor who, although suffering the twin handicaps of being American-born and American-trained, had already demonstrated the talent that would entitle him to an international could he be assured that the baton of a major orchestra would be given to him. That is why he was advised by the musical director of the Boston Symphony Orchestra to anglicize his name to Burns. In 1952, one needed to be either clairvoyant or eccentric to have foreseen the day when the president of Dartmouth would be named Friedman, when the president of Princeton would be named Shapiro, when the president of Yale would be named Levin. Bernstein's father found it so difficult to imagine the acclaim that his son would come to know that he kept reassuring Lenny that if his musical ambitions did not pan out, there would always be a place for him in the family's beauty shop supply business. But even in its concert version, the rediscovered and revived Threepenny Opera created something of a sensation that could not be confined to the Brandeis campus. An off-Broadway run that began in the late 1950s lasted nearly 9 years, longer even than the Broadway record then set by Oklahoma. Lotte Lenya's show business career was reactivated, and barely a decade after singing Pirate Jenny at Brandeis, she played the chief villain of the criminal organization known as Spectre, and came frighteningly close to killing Sean Connery as James Bond in From Russia with Love. Few artistic trajectories could have been odder, but the rediscovery of Brecht and Weil's Opera for Beggars was fittingly achieved on the campus where so many escapees from the Third Reich had found asylum. The Festival of the Arts had shown the vestigial power of a brilliant but brittle culture that had been dancing 2 decades earlier on the edge of an abyss. And in a climate of renewed repression, Brandeis University had shown itself secure enough to present a work of art that had drawn its inspiration from the communist politics of Bertolt Brecht. In its scholarship and in the arts, Brandeis University had also managed to breathe life into the endangered legacy of Weimar culture, a culture that was inflected both with a spirit of Jewishness and with an edge of dissidence. In succeeding decades, that legacy would inevitably dissipate. The pool from which to draw freewheeling, polyglot intellectuals committed to building was bound to shrink. Martin Peretz remarked, "That period of American intellectual life cannot be repeated. The elan vital of the first years of anything are very difficult to sustain. Everything gets routinized in some way," end of quote. Marginalized in their homelands, those scholars who escaped Nazism managed to find a new institutional home that enlivened academic life in the Boston area and beyond. Thanks very much. Katrin has allowed me to call on people if you have questions or comments. Yes, sir.
Would you include Professor Blitzer in your list of luminaries? Who came from Germany?
Lachenblatzer?
Yeah.
Yes, I thought of that.
I remember I was around at the time. He gave a series of lectures on the life and time of Jesus that was so well attended. I think it was originally supposed to be here. They had to move it to Levin to accommodate all the people.
Julie.
I have a question that's a little bit hard to articulate, but I'll give it a try. A lot of the people you were talking about were Jews, obviously, right? Then there was the Jews who went to the Neges department. They are Glatzer and Davidovich and Altman. I don't know if you mentioned to me about them.
Yeah, those are the key figures of the first years.
And then,
Could you repeat your
Do you repeat the
I
question?
haven't even,
No, but do we have a mic? You want to stand here?
no, so, which Professor Whitfield talked about a lot of Jewish people who are intellectuals. And what I'm interested in is how they divided when they came to Brandeis. There were the Jews of Neges, who are Altman, Glatzer, and Davidovich, and the Jews of the politics department and the sociology department, and they were Marcuse and Koser, whom I studied with, and I don't know,
Keep up the early years of the key
Right.
figures of German.
but they're both Jewish groups. And to me, there's a kind of meaningfulness that the Marcuse Koser types did not really, I think, see the Altman, Rabinovich, Glasser types as their colleagues, and vice versa. I was a student of Koser, and we didn't know so much about, I mean, a student of a couple of his courses. We didn't know so much about him as a personality, as a human being, and we didn't know if he was Jewish or not. It wasn't really quite evident. He was very elegant and very suave, and talked about France, and never talked. And he smoked a cigarette with a very long thing. What is that called? A holder. And off this very long thing, which I've never seen anybody smoke with before or after, there was a long ash. And he always wore a cravat, an ascot, he was very debonair. I'm just, not that that's important, but Alexander Altman was so proper in his being that people thought that he went to bed with a 3D suit on. But all I'm wondering is about, I think something got lost when the two different types of Jews separated so much. And really were very different kinds of people.
Thank you for the comments. I'll only respond very briefly because everything I'm trying to learn other than what's wonderfully available in the Brandeis archives and other places is really sort of anecdotal things that I've sort of picked up over the years. But my impression, and I can be corrected here on this point, is at least in the 1950s, the campus was so small, the intimacies between faculty and students and the intimacies among the faculty themselves was really easily scaled, departmental, and other sorts of barriers. So that, for example, Judith Wexler, who's the daughter of Nachum Glatzer, and who's done a wonderful documentary film about her father, told me that her father and Marcuse were in fact very good friends. Among them, that Marcuse was among her father's best friends on the Brandeis faculty. And I recently learned from an alumnus of the class of 1961 that when he and two of his roommates were living in Waltham for his senior year, he invited Herbert Marcuse and Marcuse's wife and son Peter for a Passover Seder. And the alum told me how surprised he was by how much Marcuse seemed to know about the Haggadah. And when it came time to do the 4 questions, Marcuse nominated himself to be the wicked son. But that he knew enough really to, allegedly, to fully participate. So I don't deny that there was clearly a barrier between, or a barrier of some sorts, at least a divergence, between those who were specialists in Judaic studies and the largely secular, and because they were secular, they were leftists and vice versa, the degree to which that represented a kind of ideological difference. I would only suggest to, at least based on what I the limited way I found out, it's possible to exaggerate, I think, that divergence.
Thank you.
Jerry.
Just Steve, on that point.
Yeah, please.
You know this. You mentioned Irving Howe, who was Koser's colleague at the stand of the Democratic Socialists, and where he would stand in this divide is very clear. Also a translator of Yiddish poetry, and later the author of magnificent opus of Lower East Side Yiddish culture in the United States. So the divide, which I think Shul was right about, and even if Marcuse did know about the sons and the Passover service, but I think that Howe, who I think was here until 1962 or 3, I used to go to Red Sox games with him. Howe really, in some way, is a bridge figure in that.
And of course, I didn't
point, yeah.
I didn't want to go into that because Howe was not from Germany, and I'm being asked to speak only about the Germans here. But you're right in terms of just as a figure on the campus, and I can't also minimize that when dissent is founded, the degree to which both the Germans, like Marcuse and Koser, contribute to that journal, along with the often American-born sociologists.
He was
qualification here, but this is a program on exile and persecution. And Lewison, of course, comes